Hey everyone, welcome to Cuberviews episode 21. This is your host Ian Braverman. Today I am joined by May, also known as Myagic from the Uber Cube podcast. How are you doing?
Wait a second. This is an Uber Cube. How did I get in your basement? Also, yes. Hi, I'm May, also known as Magic.
How did I get here? What's happening? I'm lost. Yeah, how are you doing tonight?
It's okay. This is preferable to the back rooms.
Yes, definitely.
I'm doing pretty okay. I am just excited to talk about things with magic and cube and whatnot. Obviously, I'm
That's
very passionate about it.
that's what
So,
we're here. Talk about Cube. It's the best part of Magic. Cube, definitely.
mhm.
Yeah, and tell us about yourself. What about your history with Magic and Cube design?
Sure. So, I actually started magic around 2010-ish. So, in terms of being old, my bones have betrayed me. I started around the time like Mirrodin Besiege New Phyrexia came out, like around that time period. So a lot of my introduction to the game was I started off with like 60 cards with like this Drake deck, then made like a decent deck that was all based around ramping out Molten Steel Dragon, and then I finally got introduced to Commander at the dismay of everybody involved. But the important part is that around 2020-ish, where we were all kind of just stuck inside, had nothing better to do, I was trying to brainstorm ways that I can enjoy Magic and like kind of rebuild decks and whatnot because I really enjoyed the draft experience, but I didn't want to just constantly have to pay for drafts, especially if it's not like sets that I actually care about. Then I stumbled upon Cube, and from there my autism kicked in. And I promise it's not an insult. That is just the truth. It became kind of a hyperfixation for me for the last several years. And it was something that started off, I want to say, a little rocky. Like, I didn't really have established play groups. I didn't have a cube that was particularly, let's say, well designed to start with. But I was able to learn a lot, improve, and ended up where I am and ended up with the fake cube, which now just almost 300 people now follow on Cube Cobra. So it's not
Yeah,
nothing.
definitely. And I totally get what you're saying that you started in 2020 and had trouble finding a play group. I mean, it was hard to get out and play Magic with people around that time.
Yeah.
And what are some of your hobbies outside of Magic?
Yeah. In terms of hobbies, I enjoy things like painting, digital painting, exclusively digital painting. I don't like actual like paint whatnot because it gets stuck on my hands, but art, drawing. I like to do things like music. I play piano, guitar, ukulele now. I know how to play harmonica of all the things, ocarina. I'm also a vocalist, which is kind of fun. And don't really do anything with my music. It is just something that I enjoy as a hobby. I tend to play a lot of other games, but for the most part, most of my hobbies are kind of centered around game design esque things, which tends to lean itself towards cube and cube design a lot.
We're really getting close to making the Cube Podcasters band. I mean, me playing piano and singing, and you playing instruments and singing, and we got Cade. We got so many people
Yeah,
with instrumentalists. It's getting closer and closer to the Cube Podcast band. It's great.
the cube podcast band.
Yes, it's going to be excellent. And I say it every week. If you happen to be in the area of Avon, Connecticut, come to our local play group at Games IRL. We're always looking for more cubers. Also, if you're looking for more UberCube content, definitely check out UberCube podcast on multiple platforms. And also, I just had a few episodes ago Anthony Adams, Uber Bear, for his horror cube. So definitely
Yeah.
check that out too. But today we are talking about a really fun cube that I actually played at Vertex Philadelphia a few weeks ago, Maze Fake Cube. Tell me about this cube.
So the fake cube is a sort of culmination of Fey inspired sets. So think Lorwyn, Morning Tide, Shadow Ward, like that entire set of blocks, right? And Eldraine. I also threw in a bit of that flavor from Innistrad to give it kind of that grim feeling. But the curveball, the important curveball here is that I also threw in cards from like Zendikar Rising and some of the D&D cards and whatnot, just that way we can have a little bit of party synergy. But for the most part, A majority of the cards in here are either related to fairy tales, grim fairy tales, or miscellaneous stories, fables like Aesop fables, whatnot. Or there's just kind of meta things like, for example, fact or fiction. It seems pretty simple. Censor, ever after, which I find is so funny in this environment. That's kind of the gist of the cube. It's as my short elevator pitch for it.
I love it. I had a great time playing it. And I know listening to Ubercube before that you mentioned that you're really looking to paint a picture with this cube.
Yes.
When players join the draft, you want them to be transported to another world. Could you give me a short story of what you're hoping the players see when they get into this cube, a visualization?
So this is actually something I was thinking about a lot before we actually started recording. And while I was pacing and thinking about how I wanted to articulate it, the best way that I can explain it is that the way that I'm trying to show off the Fake Cube for you as a drafter is that I've created a bunch of settings, a bunch of set dressing, a bunch of characters, and whatnot. Well, yes, there are things that are tangentially related where it's just like, oh, we have the beloved princess, the charming prince, and etc. Right? Our typical tropey fairy tales, whatnots, but those aren't the highlights. The highlights when you're actually going in and drafting it is with the decks that you create. And the reason why that this is important is because the Fey Cube has a very unique texture to it compared to just Eldraine, just Lorwyn, etc. The reason why is because when you are sitting down to draft, you aren't just drafting the goblins because everybody else hates the goblins. You're drafting the goblins because they are your ragtag team of storybook characters. It is essentially this idea that we have a bunch of these characters, settings, whatnot, that you don't really think about during the draft, but after the draft, you think about it in the context of how your deck you built, that you drafted, that you chose. You chose these characters, you chose these story pieces, and how they interacted with everybody else's cards and decks and whatnot. And that's what leads to the stories. How your decks interact with each other, that's what leaves something memorable. So when we think of Lorwyn and Morningtide as sets, a majority of their draft identity is centered around these subtypes, where we have goblins, elves, fairies. It makes sense. It is the intro to fairy tale, whatnot. And while, yes, Lorwyn has its own books and interesting storylines with these characters and whatnot, but for the most part, you are taking a lens into this world and the sort of competing force that exists between these tribes, okay, as they were described at the time. This matters because it creates this sense of division that you even feel in the draft, where the person who is drafting the elf deck doesn't want anything from the goblin deck. Anybody who's drafting the goblin deck doesn't want anything from the fairy deck, and so on and so forth. It was very difficult to get that glue. It was very difficult to get that overlap because narratively speaking, they are at conflict with each other. And that follows through with the mechanics. Fast forward to the year of Eldraine, and while it isn't as strongly divided, especially since Eldraine did a better job unifying its colors by being like, hey, these are the 5 different colors of the kingdoms, so to speak, right? And then we have Kenrith here that kind of acts as the unifying king, and we're trying to bring in all these elements. But there's still that kind of subcontext of here are the humans versus the non-humans, the wilds, whatnot. And that's where the tension point kind of exists because we have the characters like Oko, Rankle, whatnot, versus our human characters in their kingdoms and whatnot, trying to fill their own stories. There's a tension there. So when I first started this cube, I looked at what I really liked about the subtype related stuff with Lorwyn, and I wanted to make it work. All the stuff and the overlap that they created in Morningtide by being like, hey, now not only do you care about the main type of the creature, but now you also care about the secondary type of here are our warriors, our wizards, our shamans. Here are the overlapping categories that actually add different kinds of decks beyond just, yep, here's just our 5 different types, and that's what you're drafting. When I was looking at a top-down approach, I also wanted to add the next layer of, okay, we also had that tension point of Eldraine of humans versus non-humans, and that's interesting. However, The Zendikar Rising cards were the important part in here and is the core identifying factor of this cube, despite not being flavorfully appropriate, simply because it creates a sense of unity between these archetypes. And because you have that sense of unity between it, you aren't as restricted when it comes to the actual deck building process. Yes, sure, those lanes still exist. You can still go for your warrior decks, your goblin decks, your elves decks. But at the end of the day, your paintbrush to paint with is significantly more diverse because I didn't just take away a bunch of palettes by saying, nope, this is your lane. This is the only lane that exists. You can be a party deck. You can be warriors. You can be goblins. You can choose to not go for subtypes at all and just pick all the good stuff. You can go for overarching themes. Like, for example, I have, what were the swans called? Swans of another
Swans
piece.
of Bryn Argol or
Thank
whatever.
you, that one. And it's a combo piece with like this enchantment. And there's nothing specifically tying Jeskai to this. I'm going to try to burn this bird. And this is like, it's the entire identity. No, they're just pieces that exist. They're settings, they're dressing. They allow you as the drafter to make your story because you chose those pieces and how those pieces interact with your opponent. That's what you are going to tell afterwards. That is the part you're going to remember. And that's the part that you're going to come back to whenever you try that deck again.
Yeah, I really think it's beautiful how there are so many different concepts coming together. And I really love the design of this cube behind. Like you mentioned,
Thank
the
you.
different subtypes that have their own identity. Like my deck that I drafted when I was at Vertex, I was a blue-white ETB value link deck with my main payoff being like Archaeomancer, returning sleep
Mhm.
over and over into my hand with Riptide Lab. And I
Which
also
is
had
beautiful.
Oh yeah, it was 11 mana sick combo. It was great. But then also like Quickling, Shepherd of the Flock. It was a really sweet deck. I loved it because it was blue-white blink as the overall structure of the deck. But then
Mhm.
it also had sub-themes. Like I had some wizard sub-themes, but then I also had some fairy sub-themes that connected those together. Like I really loved how I had Fairy Harbinger in my deck, which could tutor for Winter Eldraine. And Winter Eldraine is a wizard and a fairy.
Mhm.
So then the Winter Eldraine could be brought to my hand again with the Riptide Lab. So it just created this really, really nice overlapping cross synergy where in some cubes that have really in big kindred themes like, oh, I have the goblins and I have the vampires or whatever, it feels like they don't go much past the surface and they just put in a
Mhm.
bunch of lords and they just put in a
Yep.
bunch of support for those and you're in that deck, like you said, and it doesn't
Yep.
go much deeper. But in here, you've really peppered it in, which is really nice. And it allows for decks that can be partially one subtype, include multiple subtypes together. It's really nice.
Yeah. Like I always found it really important when we were designing subtype reliant environments. A lot of the difficulties that people have when designing these types of environments is the fact that they go so hard into the subtypes that it becomes the sole identity and there's very little overlap that you can create between those. However, this is more of it is important to know your subtypes. It's important to draft around those subtypes, but it is never the dominant force behind your deck. It is never the I am sitting down in order to very explicitly try to go for the party theme unless I'm like explicitly going for that archetype, right? There's not really a point where you look at, say, Goblin King, for example, because it just doesn't exist in this cube. We see things like Imperious Prefect, which is a lord, but it also generates the tokens on its own, so it's entirely independent. And a lot of these pieces work independently. And I felt like that was the important structural backbone behind this cube of I wanted a lot of these subtypes to be relevant, but I wanted it to be incidental, where I am not trying to force you into that lane by being like, well, this color is the goblin color. I guess you're drafting goblins. No, I didn't want to do that. I wanted it so that way if you ended up drafting like Imperious Prefect and then you ended up going into some Golgari food deck or whatever, you still don't have to feel bad about taking that Imperious Prefect.
Yeah, I totally agree. I didn't even go into that draft saying I was going to be a fairy deck or a wizard deck. I
Mm-hmm.
went in saying I see some really interesting ETB value creatures and
Yep.
I see different cards like Archaeomancer and Riptide Lab. And I say, hey, that's a combination. And then my blue-white blink deck expands and includes just little hints of the subtypes, which I thought was really cool. And another deck that I thought was really cool in this cube was Anthony Mannix from Lucky Paper Radio already talked about it on
Mhm.
on Lucky Paper. We played in the finals, and his deck was a green-white elves and wolves deck. And this deck was so cool because it had payoffs that could combine the two archetypes. For example, Tolsimir, Friend of Wolves, is an elf, but it also creates the wolf. And whenever a wolf enters, you gain 3 life and you can fight something. So that was really powerful. And it really created that bridge between the two decks. Another example of that was Ren's Run Packmaster, being an elf, and it also creates wolves, and it gives your wolves death touch. So there was just a lot of examples of that in the deck that was really cool.
I'm really glad that you specifically called out Selesnya wolves and slash elves in particular. I want you to think about the last time that you played wolves in any cube, period. Right? It just doesn't come up very often. Wolves aren't exactly a common thing for starters. Secondly, I want you to think of the time ever that you've heard of Selesnya wolves.
Doesn't come to mind.
It doesn't come up to mind. Like, it's not something people think about. However, when it's actually presented here of, hey, here is our archetype that actually has somewhat to do with elves and wolves and how they overlap. And a lot of these pieces happen to overlap and create this sort of synergy between the elves and the wolves. Remember how I said in our elevator pitch, if we want to call it that, that the idea behind this cube is that there's a lot of unity and cohesion that exists between a lot of these pieces because they are set dressing. This is the example of that. The relationship between elves and wolves is its own story. It is always fascinating when people are kind of trying to draft the elf deck or trying to make like a wolf deck work. And when a lot of those themes come together to create a cohesive deck, it always surprises people. But the funniest part about this is that it wasn't initially my design. I didn't initially design it like that. I refined this because people started drafting it. Because the Wolves package that I had for a long time worked better in Selesnya than it did in the other colors. So what I did was I slowly started working on building the Selesnya Wolves package. However, there was a point in which that kind of conflict within the cohesion occurred where I did not have enough room for both enough elves and enough wolves to make it feel like that they were doing their own things within green. But over time, I was able to refine their identity by picking out and being very precise of these are a bunch of elves that care about making wolves, that care about having wolves, that overlap with elves. They create their own cohesion with that archetype. But what's particularly nice about it is that it also overlaps with some other things, like wolves happen to overlap with food. The elves happen to overlap with life gain. The elves happen to overlap with warriors. A lot of the wolves ended up being warriors just because that's what I ended up being able to find that were also within that party. So it was easier to create that kind of cohesive identity the more that those pieces started to overlap. Like, it is very difficult to think of Ren's Run Packmaster as a card without this type of a deck. Like, sure, it can fit into elf decks, but that's not a card that people go out of their way to throw in their elf decks, right? Unless it's Volja. And at that point, you're just very explicitly just taking apart a commander deck and throwing it into keep. But what's neat about it is that the more that people started to draft it, the more that I was able to read what their signals were, the decks that they were trying to draft, and more that I could try to refine the deck that people wanted to draft. And that's why it became such an iconic and unique identity to the Fake Cube.
Yeah, I think that that's amazing where you saw what drafters were trying to do and then allow them to do it over multiple iterations of the cube. I think that's something that a lot of cube owners don't do. They see somebody going some weird combination. They say, that's not what I wanted them to
Mm-hmm.
do. I'm going to try and take that out. But instead, you pushed into it.
Yep.
And I think that's really awesome. And another thing about this cube is that it's a budget cube.
Yes.
And in addition to being a budget cube, I would place it at around a lower to mid power cube, probably like a peasant
Yeah.
cube plus. So I think that those two things combine to allow these synergies to blossom. I think that if the cube was in a higher power level, cards like Imperious Perfect, where it is a 3 mana 2/2 if you don't have any other elves, but every turn you can make a 1/1 elf that's really a 2/2. I wouldn't say that's fast, but
Right.
because this environment is not have an extremely quick aggro deck and it's a lower to mid power cube, those synergies get to really blossom and it allows players to get to the late game and see these cross synergies expand.
Right. So I feel that lower power cubes were kind of an underappreciated, underexplored, underutilized part of cube design for a long period of time. Like, especially once I got into the cube community around 2020, this was like the time in which Ben's Cube started to get pushed out and was no longer a website. We started just at the cusp of Cube Cobra starting to come in. We came in at the time when people were starting to kind of entertain the possibility of what can cubes do and what can't cubes do and whatnot. The resources weren't quite there because even though we had the data, we had previous people talking about cubes and cube design and whatnot. A lot of it was more focused around optimizing your environment and picking the best cards for the certain archetypes that you're wanting to support and whatnot. There wasn't really a focus on thematic cubes. There wasn't really a focus on low power. Like, yes, there was pauper peasant cubes, obviously. I'm not saying that. But when it came to those pauper and peasant cubes, there was this sort of, let's say, agreed upon thing that we're just trying to throw in the best of these cards, where it's, yep, this is within the restriction and this is what we're trying to do. And it's not that other low power cubes didn't exist or other thematic cubes didn't exist, obviously. It is a matter of they weren't really given the chance to explore during Ben's Cube's era. Versus Cube Cobra came out and took over that entire mantle, and it became easier and easier to see what people were brewing with, what people were coming up with beyond just here's the core of a cube and here's what my changes look like within that base of a cube. And when I looked at a lot of the older content for Ben's Cubes and whatnot, people had a lot of room to explore. That's the nature of cube. I wanted to create a base of a cube that I myself could experiment with. It was never initially intended to be as popular as it is right now. It was never intended to be the thing that people come to clone. It started as a thing for me to work on and refine because the Fey Cube was not my first cube. This was not my initial cube. This was the cube that stuck because what it did was reflective of something beyond its play pattern. And that is the part that I was able to capitalize on. Like, if you've ever seen the earliest versions of the Fey Cube, and that is not a prompt for you to look at the differences between the oldest version of the Fey Cube and now, just putting that out there. Its identity was a little bit more scattered, but the idea was there, where it was very clearly an artistic interpretation, if you will, of a lot of these thematic ideas of fairy tales and whatnot, and having my callouts. Like, one of my favorites is a card like Scorn Villager has been in the Fey Cube basically since its conception because it is a thematic cube. It is a cute little reference to something. And sure, mechanically, it doesn't make a lot of sense in here. However, it is in here because this is my Little Red Riding Hood. This is the little note that I can be like, yeah, see, this is the cute thing that I'm doing. And that was fine at a base level. But as I started to develop as a cube curator and get better at curating what the environment I wanted to make was, the experience that I wanted people to have, and started refining those archetypes and refining down the subtypes into things that were a lot more cohesive and figuring out, hey, which things are actually too strong, too weak, whatnot, what things actually bring our whole packages together. The more and more I was able to bring the Fey Cube to what it is now.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting to see the explosion of lower to mid power cubes that we've seen, but
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's still a lot more room for it to grow. Like, for
Absolutely.
example, when I look at most pauper or peasant cubes and I play them, they almost, like you said, all feel the same.
Yeah.
Like 95% of the cards are the same. I have a pauper cube, I have a peasant cube, and when I play somebody else's, I'm like, why am I even building this cube? It's like the same as theirs. I think that there's so much more room for lower power peasant and pauper cubes to exist.
We saw that a lot with the tools that existed during that period, where it was just like, here are the most popular cube cards, the things that people are throwing in their cubes. And then it created interesting conversations that for cube content at that time of, oh, we can talk about why I wanted to include these things or remove these things from my cube. And the center point of the cube discussion was more of optimizing between cards that were already kind of established in the cube community, which is not a bad thing. But like you said, there's just so much more room to expand past that.
Yeah, and listening to cube discourse, for example, Lucky Paper talking about the regular cube and people asking, why do you not just have this be a peasant cube? Or why have a peasant cube not just include rares? And seeing the discourse around lower power cubes grow,
Mm-hmm.
for people listening, I would love to see people design more peasant and pauper cubes that aren't power maxed. So that's your assignment. I would love to see that. And moving on to the next topic that I wanted to talk about was, tell me about the power outliers and how they fit into this cube. For
Sure.
example, when I played the cube at Vertex, Tolsimir was a really beautiful card in that it connected the wolves and the elves, but it definitely felt like a power outlier.
Oh,
Very
yeah.
strong card. Tell me about when you pepper in these power outliers. And for example, you mentioned Voja. How far do you go without going too far?
Well, obviously, Voja is never going to be in consideration. I'm just going to snuff that right now. But when we're talking about a lot of the power outliers, this kind of came from, I guess the best way to put it is an older form of thinking about cube when we were talking a lot more about optimization and whatnot, where the goal of those cubes were to reduce the power outliers. That way, all the cards are relatively the same. So that way, every booster pack is a difficult decision between here's my Black Lotus and here's Ancestral Recall. Which are you going to choose? And there's interesting discussions to be had, but at the end of the day, you're still choosing between like relatively closely powerful cards. And that was kind of our innate start for a lot of these cubes. And it's not to say that that's what all cubes were, obviously. That's just in the extreme case of like vintage cubes. But as people started branching out and experimenting a lot more with their cubes, we got a lot more room for people to reassess what the purpose of power outliers are. The reason that power outliers exist in the Fey Cube is because they aren't just the lane defining cards, but they are also the deck defining cards. They are the cards that when they show up in a pack, that they are noteworthy. They are cards that are either going to change the way that you're drafting, they're going to be changing the way that your deck interacts with them, or in the rare cases of they aren't in my color, but now I know somebody else is going to have that. Whoever's like going next might take that. And it creates an interesting context. The reason that they're important is that they also create breakpoints in the actual gameplay. Like the thing about lower power cubes, it's not my goal to only recreate just retail draft, obviously. At that point, we could just create a set cube and call it a day. That's not the point. The point is that these outlier cards are identifiable, they're tutorable, and they're important because they're the sort of boss monsters of the respective decks that they find themselves in. And the reason that it matters is because they are game defining. When Una comes out, that is a threat. If you're able to cheat Una out, that is a threat. If you're able to stick Tolsimer, that is a threat. Another big one is something like Boggart Mob or Mirror Entity. I can go on and on. But if you ever look at my actual Fake Cube lists, I actually have them highlighted in yellow,
Yeah, the
very
stars. I
explicitly
think
to
that's
call
very
them
cool.
stars. Yeah. The reason why is because I recognize that the game needs to end, and especially in lower power, you can end up in the problem where people are kind of just dirtling with each other and slowly trading resources, especially when you take into the top down appreciation here that there is mill and life gain in these, which are two like cardinal sins for a majority of other cubes. Like most curators don't touch those themes, because they can make games just take forever and not end. But we don't have that problem here. Why? Because we have star cards. We have these game ending threats. We have the cards that come out and make themselves known. These are the cards like Wolverine Riders, for example. That's a big one where, hey, just at the beginning of each upkeep, I just make another elf and gain some more life. And that's usually enough to just push people out. It's not to say that there's something innately wrong with people who want to have that cohesiveness in terms of power level and they want it to be like relatively close to make the pack one pick ones more interesting and whatnot. And it's easy to look at the weird niche cases where it's just like, okay, here's a bunch of pack one pick ones, and a certain amount of those just happen to have star cards in them, and that doesn't really make for interesting packs, except it does. Because there are times in which you want to choose the consistent cards, the engine cards, the land cards, the things that search for land cards, the tutors, the whatnot. There are other packages and whatnot that are happening that aren't innately powerful game ending whatnot cards that you are just as likely to consider in that pack as Tulsimer. If Tulsimer comes up, you could try to force that deck, and you would probably have a pretty good deck if you did that, right? But there's also a chance that if you take that Tulsimer, you don't end up in the right colors because it wasn't actually open. And that's why it kind of creates an interesting draft experience that you don't get in a lot of other cubes. Because those highlighted cards, you know, are going to be either in your deck, in somebody else's deck, or you need to choose the good, consistent cards that are more likely to be competed for and the less likely that people are going to dedicate themselves into that lane.
Yeah, I think that the power outliers add really interesting things to the gameplay. For example, in a lower power cube where everything feels samey, it's like 3 mana, 3/3s that have an ETB, or a 2 mana, 2/2. When you have removal and interaction in a cube like that, it can kind of feel like, I don't really know what to remove. I guess I'll kill this 3/3. I don't know. When there are really strong power outliers that you know you have to look for, it creates some strategy in the cube also, where it's
Yes,
saying, oh, they're in the Green White Wolves deck. I saw this Tolsimir. I need to be ready to answer this, and I need to not blow this 3 mana counter spell. I need to use it for the right time.
exactly. And that right there is why I love having power outliers for low powered cubes, because it creates an innate sort of strategy behind your picks. It's like, yes, sure, you could try to pick that 2 color strong card and possibly end up with a pretty good deck, or you could just take the removal piece and kill the person who did take it.
That's
Because
often what I
this is
do.
a
I want
place
to
where
be
mid range
control.
is king, right? We have so much time on our hands to prepare these first few turns of how am I going to answer your big threat cards, because I know they're coming. And unlike in limited draft, where the assumption is, well, on every new booster, everybody gets like a rare, and sometimes that rare is just really good, or sometimes it's just really bad. There's the kind of variance between it. In here, when those star cards come up, you're not going to see a deck that was going to run all of the star cards. It's just not going to happen. Even if it did happen, I would say that that's more of the irresponsible drafting as opposed to everything. But my point being that when you are able to strategize around these cards that are roughly around the same power level, it creates an interesting relationship with your decks. And kind of what I was explaining back on our first point of these are set pieces. And your relationship with these set pieces changes as you play this cube and as you get better and continue to draft in these archetypes and learn what those power outliers are. The more interesting interactions you get to have because of it. And that's beautiful.
Yeah, and it also creates story moments for the cube.
Yes.
I definitely remember losing to Anthony with the Tolsimir because that card was really good, and it makes me want to replay the cube. It says, I want to be the Tolsimir player next time.
Plus, I'll just let you know that this is one of the few cubes where Selesnya is actually like a good color combination. The Fey
Yes.
cube's weird. It's a weird environment. It is deceptively weird.
Yes.
We have Mill, we have Life Gain, and we have like Selesnya that's like an actually good, high performing color combination. There are weird things happening here, but the games actually end at reasonable times, despite all that.
Yes. Which is really great. And so I have another question for
Yeah,
you.
with
So
it.
this cube is a budget cube.
Yes.
So that means You could build this cube. I see on Cube Cobra it says the TCG player for $166. It's weird. The Card Kingdom says 733. I don't know why there's that big difference.
It has to do with the versions, but more importantly, if you get the cheapest versions of it, you can get it for less than $100.
Oh, even better.
Easily, you can build this cube for less than $100. The reason that my version is at 167 is because my cube's kind of decked out. I wanted the foils, I wanted the pretty cards, I wanted the showcases, I wanted to fill out my things with pretty cards. But you don't need those. You don't need to have the pretty cards. If you just want the experience, you'll get the experience. You don't
Yeah.
lose that much for losing the aesthetic, right? However, for my cube, since it's kind of my little artistic baby, so to speak, I just wanted it to be a little more souped up. But less than $200 is still relatively budget compared to a lot of cubes.
Yeah. Sure, you can build this cube for less than $100, but this cube, a big draw to it is the aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like you're losing part of the gameplay by not having those versions that really coincide with the gameplay and the aesthetic that you're building.
Yeah, definitely can lose a little bit if you go for the cheaper versions, but ultimately it comes down to the choice of the person who like clones this cube or makes their own version of this cube. The thing that became the most interesting about this cube and how it accidentally became a sort of central node on the little map of cubes. I didn't initially plan for this to be a budget cube. It just ended up as a budget cube because I'm broke. Expensive cubes are a pain. And yes, I know technically I can go out and proxy and just have whatever cube I wanted, but I wanted to use my cards. I wanted to use cards that I played with that I enjoyed in limited situations and cards that I've enjoyed in decks, whatnot. I wanted a place, a home for my cards that I've collected. So for me, it was started off as a budget because that was the way that I could have a home for the cards that I cared about. That is how this cube started, was that I love the showcase Eldraine cards. They're beautiful. Their frames are gorgeous. Their arts are gorgeous. They do such a good job with their visual storytelling, like incorporating from the frame and their alternate art. And it's just, oh, so good. And I wanted a home for those. But the only way that I could create that home was to incorporate it as low power. So while, yes, the budgetary restriction has to do mostly with the fact that I didn't want to throw a bunch of money into something that I wasn't sure how often I was actually going to play it, it's mostly started from a restriction of, let's say, power. This idea that I have a set of cards that I ideally want to keep in here for as long as I can. And how am I going to support an environment that allows them to exist here?
Yeah, you have your core cards that you want to be good in the cube. And if you make the cards around it too powerful, and often powerful means expensive,
Yep,
then you lose the initial reason that made you want to build this cube in the first place.
exactly. It's especially true for like fairies. I could see a world in which I built a version of the Fey Cube that's like, hey, this is the high power Fey Cube, where we're taking the concept and we're ramping it up. We're taking the best cards in these slots. But at the end of the day, if I do that, it loses the core identity of why I built this cube. And it's just the inevitable truth that cards like Scorn Villager will just get pushed out.
Yeah.
And like the day I cut Curious Pair is going to be a sad day because Curious Pair is just such a beautiful card and is representative of like what Eldraine's fairy tales were about, where they're haunting, but they're also this representative of Eldraine like as a set and beautiful art that shows the witch's hands underneath. And it's why Ristic Study had an entire video about why it's such a good card. And it itself is not a good card. If I were to raise the power of this cube, Curious Pair would not have a home. Scorned Villager would not have a home. Yeah, sure. What I would gain is a more powerful experience that let people play with more interesting cards and more interesting mechanics. However, I will argue that the things that make this cube so interesting and so intricate is because there's that power restriction, because we know like the maximum power level. We can point to the cards that say, this is the thing raising the power, and not much is getting beyond that.
But are there any cards you would include if you didn't have the budget restriction? Like, for example,
Whew.
you do have the common type duels from Dominaria. Would you put in Shocklands instead? Tell me about what you would change if you did have no budget.
So it's interesting that you point out the lands in specific because I actually wouldn't change the lands.
Oh,
The reason why is because I very explicitly wanted tap lands to be like a part of this cube. What this means is that if you want that fixing, you want that color variety, you want to be able to get your colors and get into these big, stupid cards, there is a cost. There is a significant turn cost. You can't just play all the cards. So remember how I said earlier that you can't just make a deck that has all the star cards, all the good cards. You just can't play it. There is not a structure that is flexible enough, fast enough, whatnot to allow you to just take all the best cards, assuming that everybody else just decided to lose that day, right? There's not a structure to support that.
I'm
Even
sure
if you
some
did
people have
snipe
tried to
all
do
these,
that.
yeah, of course they will. But what makes a lot of these like power drafters, let's call them spike drafters, right? What makes a lot of their endorphins run, dopamine, whatever, one of those happy chemicals. What makes their day is when they are able to properly assess what the correct pick is, what the correct power level of those cards are, and they're able to pick the best cards every single pack and have every single one of those cards feel relevant to their actual deck. That's what feels good. That's not to say that having good fixing lands somehow takes away from that. And when you're moving up to the different power grades and whatnot, it's easy for us to take for granted how important lands are and how important that fixing is and how important that speed is. Like the difference between being able to have a certain percentage of time being able to cast my 3-drop that's 2 colors compared to if I had an untap land is substantial. There is a significant cost. Because there is that significant cost to there being a tap land, it actually lets some of these archetypes flourish because it slows the game down. That is why mill exists. That is why life gain exists. That's why some of these other weird value engines come to be, like your flicker deck, right? Those are only able to exist because it is slow. It's not to say that there isn't a world in which there could be a fake cube that has the faster lands and everything's fine and I don't know what I'm talking about. However, it was a very intentional decision here. That being said, I think that the main complaint that I have at the moment is the fact that I have a bunch of the Lord of the Rings land cycling cards, which I suppose the flavor is not the worst. Like, they're forgivable enough. However, because they're the universes beyond type thing, those cards are eventually going to get more and more expensive, and I'm not super happy about that. However, it wouldn't be much better if I had good lands and fetch lands and whatnot. And at that point, why am I even fighting for that uniqueness in the land section anyways? The whole point is that I'm trying to go for like this budget-friendly approach. The whole point is that I wanted to have these slower lands that we kind of had to work around in order to get your engines going, so to speak.
I will say, I think that your strategy worked. I am definitely the kind of drafter that when I'm in a cube and I start to see powerful lands, I see a fetch land, I see shocks, I see triomes, my my neurons start firing and I say, okay, I'm going to take Tulsimir. Okay, we're good. Okay, now I'm going to take Spoils of Adventure. Now I'm banned. Okay, but I can definitely splash this red card. Okay, so now I'm 4 colors. Oh, I just got to take some fetches and shocks. I'll be good. And
Yep.
I think that that is when things start to fall apart. But I definitely did think when I was doing this Cubit Vertex, okay, I'm going to try and do this strategy. But those slower lands kind of stopped me. I made me
Yep.
think, you know, is it a good idea for me to be playing all these tap lands and be some crazy 5-color thing when I could, like you said, focus on the strategies that were intended and really still have a really strong deck that made me
Mhm.
happy.
I feel like that's the important part. The fact that 3-color decks aren't uncommon here. Like, they're pretty strong decks to go into 3 colors. The 2 colors is obviously where it's going to be the most optimal in the majority environments, but in this specific one, because it is slow, there is an innate cost. You see an actually reasonable amount of monocolor decks compared to 3-color decks compared to 2-color decks. It is weirdly balanced for what it is. yes, we still have the like Selesnya Wolves, which is a very dominant force. However, there are times where I've seen Mardu aggro packages pop up, or just because, hey, I happen to have a lot of these top end, scary, aggressive threats. I'm just going to stack them all in one deck and then just trying to focus my early game around making sure that you can't stop those big dumb things from dropping down.
And if my mana falls apart, it falls apart.
Exactly.
There's
So
a cost to it.
the cost creates interesting gameplay and it creates unique gameplay.
And there are some cards that are pretty expensive, but
Mm.
they're also very powerful. Would you include any of these without the budget restriction? For example, Cavern of Souls, Three Tree City, Bitter Blossom, Kindred Discovery. These are all really strong payoffs for being in a Kindred theme, but they're expensive.
Yeah.
Are any of these cards that without the restriction you'd consider playing?
So Mutavault, yes. If Mutavault was cheap, like there was that one colorless manland that becomes a 2/2 assembly worker, I think it was.
Mishra's Workshop. No,
No,
Mishra's Factory. No.
it's one of those. The point is that if it was around the same cost as that, it would be an auto click. Period. Like I have manlands in here. It's not out of place. The fact that just having a manland that could be any type is exactly what I would want in this environment, and it wouldn't drastically upend what the identity of the cube is. It would just reinforce it. If I didn't have the restriction in place, that would go in. Bitter Blossom, on the other hand, would completely upend a lot of the fairies and value stuff and whatnot, because after a certain point, that card is such an outlier, so far gone compared to what everything else is doing, that it's no longer the definitive power card that people are going to draft early. It is more of the, yep, I'm going to play it on turn 2. I'm going to just start generating flyers they can't deal with, and then I'm just going to keep spamming my control cards and my adventure cards to just keep your stuff off the board. So, GG.
Yep.
Like, that's the extent where I'm like, some of these cards are expensive because they're powerful. Some of these cards are just expensive because they're expensive. And something like Mutavault, great, excellent. Another great example is if I were to include, say, one of each of the guilds typal cards, where they're like the goblin one, the fairy one, whatnot. The main issue with those is that they don't quite overlap the types that I need them to be, but regardless, the point is that they are that kind of typal payoff that we are looking for when it comes to lands. They can potentially come in untapped, kind of like what Temple of the Dragon Queen already does. If they were cheap, I would consider throwing them in. I don't feel like that they would upend a majority of what we're doing here. If we were to take it a step further and something like Glenelendra, that would be something that I would maybe consider trying, but it would be like oppressively strong in this environment. It would definitely bring up a sort of teamer control deck that would be just too difficult to deal with. But it is at least interesting thought-wise of being like, how far could you push the budget without losing the identity of the cube?
You also got to be careful with having Grumgully and Glenelendra, then you get some persist combo, and
Yep.
I'm excited about that.
Look, I'm just really happy that I finally got that combo put in and nothing exploded. Nothing got lit on fire. I was so worried about it because I was sitting there with Grumgully when I initially made this cube, and I was just like, look, I love what Grumgully does. I want to have him be relevant, but I also don't want it to just be, yes, I now have the persist combo. I win, haha. And I was so worried about it, but it seems to be fine, actually. Where for the most part, yes, it's come up. There are people who've drafted it and like gotten relatively high win rates with those cards.
Murderous
But
Redcap.
yeah, with Murderous Redcap being included, it actually really stabilized goblins as a threat. And I feel like that was important to note. And especially when this environment has a lot of tutors, like I mentioned. The big part of this environment is the fact that we have a bunch of these weird, silly engine cards or combo cards or whatnot that you can actively grab. You can go look for them. You have the tools to do so. And because of that, it leads to interesting gameplay.
Yeah, definitely. And let's jump into a pack one, pick one here.
Sure.
I'll read it off. We got Lower Scale Coatl, fantastic Simic card, 1 blue green, 2/2. Whenever you draw a card, you put a 1/1 counter on it. I had that in my Peasant Cube for a long time. Fantastic card. Fertile Ground, 1 green, enchant land. and adds an additional color of mana. That card's great. Run Vanquisher, which is a 3/3 for 2. Oh, so good. But you have to reveal an elf, or it costs 3 more. Radiant Grove, the green-white tap duel. Mud Brawler Cohort, 1 in red for a 1/1 with haste. Gets +1/+1 as long as you control another red creature. Lityara Glade Warden, which is pretty strong when I was playing against Anthony. That card's really good. Which is a 4 mana 3/3 changeling. You can pay 3 and exile a creature card from your graveyard to put 2/1/1 counters on it, only as a sorcery. It gets a little worse when I'm bouncing it every turn to his hand, but that's okay. Thrill of Possibility, which is an instant. Discard a card, draw 2. Goblin Dark Dwellers. Oh, this brings me back memories of the Gatewatch. I love this card. 5 mana, 4/4 Menace and Goblin. And when it enters, you cast a instant sorcery that costs 3 or less from your grave. Pepper Smoke. If you control a fairy, you draw a card and it gives a creature -1/-1. These effects I find to be very good. Like that card was really strong. I also was very impressed with Stream of Unconsciousness that gives something -4/-0. And if you control Wizard, you draw. Really good. And then we have Eliminate. 1 in a black, destroy a creature 3 or less, or Planeswalker. Then we have Fairy Harbinger. I love this card. I had such a fun time with it. Flash, 4 mana 2/2 in blue. And when it enters, you search your deck for a fairy and put it on top. Cooped Up, which is a pacifism that can exile the creature. Goblin Motivator, 1/1 goblin for 1 that can give something haste. Burning Prophet, 1 in a red for a 1/3 whenever you cast a non-creature spell. Gets +1/+0 and scry 1. It is a Kiln Fiend. And then multi-class Baldric, which this card I think is pretty strong.
It's
It
so
gets
strong.
it's an equipment that costs 1, equip 2. It gives it lifelink if you have a cleric, death touch if you control a rogue, haste if you control a warrior, and fly if you control a wizard. And if you have a full party, prevent all damage that be dealt to it. The party sport is something we didn't get super in depth with, but I think that's such a interesting part of the cube. Like I just accidentally was playing Spoils of Adventure in my blue-white deck, and it was just like 3 mana, draw 3, gain 3. That card is really good. So
Yeah,
that card
it's
was
so good.
Party is a really fun addition to this cube. So what do you think of this pack here?
Yeah, so I think there are potentially 4 correct choices. In terms of which one I will choose, I will just start off by saying Goblin Dark Dwellers. However, I think that the 4 that I would say are the most relevant is the multi-class Baldric, Goblin Dark Dwellers, Fairy Harbinger, and Radiant Grove. The reason why I'm highlighting those 4 in particular is that Radiant Grove we can highlight as a sort of spike pick, where I'm familiar enough with what wins, what shows up in the environment, because obviously it's my cube, it's what I'm familiar with, and I recognize that there is not a lot of green cards in here that I particularly care about for a Selesnya deck. So if I were to take this now, I get a lot more room to force myself into that lane if I wanted to. Next is the Fairy Harbinger, and I feel like that one is also just a really strong pick because there's a ton of changelings for starters. This includes changeling instants and sorceries. There are a lot of powerful fairies. There are a lot of powerful changeling instants and sorceries. And knowing that I'll have a flash 2/2 flyer that can grab any of these to take on my turn is particularly huge, especially when I see Pepper Smoke also in this pack, right? If that Pepper Smoke comes back to me, because let's say the rest of the players didn't end up drafting into Dimir Fairies or whatnot, if that comes back, then I can get another option with the Pepper Smoke, right? The last one was multi-class Baldric, which I think might be the most powerful option here, just because if you could put it on a changeling, then it just gets all of those keywords, which is huge.
Bonkers.
It's bonkers. It is ridiculous. And there are powerful changelings. Like if you wanted to go into the Orzhov party or mono white aggro decks, multi-class Baldric is huge in that deck because it very explicitly says, hey, you know that changeling that's a 5-drop basically has affinity for subtypes, and then it has double strike, and you just slap that on it. You basically are in a winning position super early in the game.
Valiant
right?
Changeling.
Yeah. But I'm going to go for Goblin Dark Dwellers because I very explicitly like spellslingery stuff, and that can lead into spellslingery stuff. And my fail case is that this is just a really strong Goblin top end. So
I have 2 directions that I'm looking at. I don't know if I'm off base for saying that I think Pepper Smoke is really good.
Pepper smoke is good.
and would maybe consider taking it. I don't know if I would take the Fairy Harbinger and then the Pepper Smoke. When I played this cube before, the Harbinger print pretty late. I think that people just don't appreciate the tutor putting it on top of the deck. People say, "Oh, that's not good putting it on top." It's
Maybe
a
not.
4 mana 2/2. So I think that there's a chance that Pepper Smoke I take and then wheel the Fairy Harbinger. But
That's fair enough.
I
And
think that multi-class Pauldrick is really good.
it's really good. I don't think you're wrong about the pepper smoke. I might be the one who's wrong here just because the Harbinger is more likely to wheel. And I think that you might be correct in that assessment.
I think I'm taking the Baldric though. I mean, it
Aldrich
keeps
is
you
really good.
so open. Even if you just give one ability, it's a 1 mana equipment, and you just give your creature lifelink, or you give your creature flying. Flying is crazy. And I think that I'm on Baldric. That seems really good.
It's a really good card. It is why it's very explicitly a star card.
Yes. That card really excited me. And then similar to this card, Conjurer's Mantle, when I saw that in the cube, when I played against that, 1 and a white gives +1/+1 vigilance equipment, and you just draw a card whenever it attacks, basically. This card was really good in Anthony's deck. So that card is
It's
good.
bonkers. It's real good.
And May, it's been really fun having you on the
Yeah.
show. I would love to have you on again in the future. Anything you want to say before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think it's time that we say the thing that we always say here. Now, have you ever done this ending before? Where we take a moment and we take a deep breath in and we say happy cubing.
Hey, I have a couple things I want to say before the end there.
Sure, say your things, do your thing.
Everyone, definitely, like I said before, check out UberCube. And if you haven't, please like, subscribe, follow the podcast, 5 stars, all that fun stuff. I would appreciate it. And now let's do it in 3, 2, 1. Happy
Happy
cubing!
cubing.
Woo!